In the great debate about evolution here in Oxford in 1860, everyone knows the myth that Thomas Huxley won a great victory for the forces of science over the backwards forces of religion. We saw last time that Huxley was a spin doctor who controlled the story in the years after the debate. But how did the myth grow beyond that?
So therefore, if nothing is there in the 1860s, nothing in the 1870s, why is it starts to grow up in the 1890s? For a good reason. Well, Huxley and various of his friends had actually sent letters to Darwin. Darwin had not been present at this so-called event. He'd been ill. He'd been at what we might now call a sanatorium at Richmond, just outside London. And his friends were writing to him. All the men who wrote to him were strongly evolutionary Darwinians. Yes, they said which the bishop was supposed to have said about the monkeys and so on. And then, of course, young Huxley comes along and bang, smashes into it like that. But others actually mention that nobody could hear what Huxley said. When you read the newspaper account of this, Jackson's Oxford Journal, you find that there are about 5 men who speak, not just one. And do you know, they're pretty well all fellows of the Royal Society. Darwin dies in 1883, and Darwin's son edited his father's papers. Here he puts himself forward as the man who had more or less seen the event, and of course all the material prints the letters from Huxley and all the others. Now hang on, at the time, the son hadn't been there. He was only 12 in 1860. It is with his parents in London. But when you read the account, you get the impression he was also an eyewitness. You get careful crafting. And of course then, a few years later, Huxley dies. And his life and letters are published with the same sort of things. By 1900, 1910, you are taking the I said this, he said this, I smashed the bishop, and so on. And these are being crafted into a legendary history. And that is what we start to inherit. But what about Wilberforce himself? Sadly, he had no capacity to intervene. He had been killed in a riding accident in the early 1870s. But it seems that Huxley and Wilberforce had sat next to each other at dinners in the intervening years, in the 1860s. Wilberforce famously affable, well-known wit, and no mention at all in the contemporary literature. So yes, in the 20th century, this legend of the great conflict grows and grows, and the words are set in stone. And Richard Dawkins wanted to have one of these things set up at the University Museum, but I caused a bit of a stink about that in Oxford some years ago, and things had to be modified. Because simply, the nearer you get to the original event, the less and less information there is.
The myth grew up in the years after Darwin and Huxley had died, as their sons published their lives and letters. Wilberforce had died in 1873, so he didn't have any chance to put the record straight. But beyond this, at the end of the 19th century, the story of the Great Debate got caught up in a wider attempt to push the myth of science and faith in conflict, as we'll see next time.